The station people turn to for news. Cake, TV 10, Wichita.
From Cake Television and the state's most honored broadcast news operation, this is the 6 o'clock edition.
Good evening, I'm Rose Stanley. Right now, Governor John Carlin is on his way to China. He'll be in the Far East for nearly 3 weeks as part of a trade delegation that's trying to find new markets for Kansas agriculture and industry. Cake's Larry Hatteberg and Bernie Koch are with the governor on this trip. Reporter Craig Owensby was there when they all set out from Kansas City this morning.
A 3-week foreign tour requires a lot of baggage, and it helps to be there early if you want to make sure everything gets onto the right airplane.
Well, if I don't have it now, I'll never have it.
Governor Carlin heads a traveling party of 22 state officials, business leaders, and reporters. They'll spend tonight in Hong Kong before heading on to Guangzhou, Beijing, and Tokyo.
We have an excellent location. We have a wonderful workforce, an excellent climate in a variety of ways, business climate and so forth, good transportation. We have great potential for a lot of people worldwide as they expand into the worldwide market.
The Kansas Trade Mission is one of 19 foreign trips that the governors of various states are taking this summer. But unlike some of the others, this trip is concerned more with long-term results than any immediate goal.
The big picture is long range, as is always the case in economic development. It's what you do now, the seeds you plant today that's going to make the difference in 5 years or 10 years in terms of our economy, jobs, and the opportunities that Kansans will have.
The governor's calling this a follow-up to his first China trip 5 years ago. The trade delegation will work on finding new markets for Kansas products and technology, areas where the Japanese have shown some interest, but the Chinese market is relatively untouched. Craig Owensby, Cake News, Kansas City.
Well, Governor Carlin is on his way to China right now. He'll be there and in Japan and Hong Kong for nearly 3 weeks as part of a trade delegation that's trying to find new markets for Kansas agriculture and industry. A total of 19 states are sending their governors on foreign trade missions this summer. The Kansas group is working more on long-term business relationships than on any specific immediate deals.
The big picture is long range, as is always the case in economic development. It's what you do now, the seeds you plant today that's going to make the difference in 5 years or 10 years in terms of our economy, jobs, and the opportunities that Kansans will have.
The governor is calling this a follow-up to his first China trip 5 years ago. Larry Hatteberg and Bernie Koch are traveling with the Kansas delegation. They'll be filing reports from China and Japan as the trip progresses. Well, Governor Carlin's trade mission to China is now 1 day old, and most of it has been spent just getting across the Pacific. Members of the trade mission spent that time differently, and Larry Hatteberg tells us how First Lady Karen Carlin is handling the long flight to the Far East.
The First Lady of Kansas, Karen Carlin, is also accompanying her husband on this trade mission to the Far East. The governor and his wife traveled in the first class section of the aircraft, while the rest of his entourage remained in coach. The governor only had coach tickets too, but the airline upgraded his tickets to first class at no extra charge to the state. On the flight from San Francisco to Hong Kong, Mrs. Carlin spent much of her time reading about a former First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter. Then, arriving in Hong Kong after a 13-and-a-half-hour nonstop flight, Mrs. Carlin said she was exhausted and retired to her room for the night. Some other members of the governor's staff planned to do some limited sightseeing, but most were simply too tired. Tomorrow, Mrs. Carlin will join her husband for a noon luncheon and an evening reception with the acting Consul General of Hong Kong. Larry Hatteberg, Cake News, Hong Kong.
At this hour, Governor John Carlin is about to begin a busy day in Hong Kong. Carlin and a group of businessmen are traveling to the Far East in an effort to drum up some opportunities for Kansas business. Cake's Bernie Koch is traveling with the group and filed this report by telephone.
It is now shortly after 7 a.m. in Hong Kong. Governor Carlin and his Asia Trade Mission arrived here last night after more than 17 straight hours of travel. This morning, the group will receive 2 briefings, one by the acting U.S. Consul General to Hong Kong and one by officials of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council. The governor's group will stay in Hong Kong until Sunday, when it will leave for the mainland by train. There's already been one slight problem. We were told persons departing this British Crown colony will only be allowed to leave with 1 bag each. Many in the group have more than one. However, since this contingent is being led by the governor of Kansas, it's felt an exception will be made to that rule. From Hong Kong, this is Bernie Cook, Cake News.
For Koch's Larry Hatteberg, this is the second time he's joined the governor for a trade mission to the Far East. This trip, Larry will concentrate on the people and places they encounter. Tonight, his impressions of Hong Kong.
When the governor arrived in Hong Kong, a large banner welcoming him to the city was spread across the airport concourse. The governor's arrival coincided with new information about what the future holds for Hong Kong businesses once this British Crown colony reverts back to Chinese control in 1997. Hong Kong television reports tonight that negotiations with the Chinese have produced a promise from the People's Republic that China will continue to maintain the lifestyle of Hong Kong, and that in turn would allow most businesses to operate as they do now. Hong Kong television also reported that the Chinese may also offer dual citizenship to Hong Kong residents. This is important news for the governor's current trade mission to the Far East because Hong Kong serves as an important business link to mainland China. Larry Hatteberg, Cake News, Hong Kong.
Kansas Governor John Carlin and company are still in Hong Kong tonight on their way to China for a trade mission. Koch's Larry Hatteberg and Bernie Cook are along on the trip. Tonight, Bernie tells us the topic of discussion in Hong Kong was the economy.
Most of the goods produced in China for export to other countries come to Hong Kong first, and the economy of the British Crown colony is thriving because of it. It's Friday morning here, and the governor and his trade mission will hear about the Hong Kong connection from a U.S. official. Acting Consul General Richard Williams and other consulate officials will brief the governor. Then, officials of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council will brief the governor on their side of the economic picture. The governor and his entourage will stay in Hong Kong until Saturday. Then it's on to the People's Republic of China by train. From Hong Kong, this is Bernie Cook, Cake News.
In Hong Kong today, Governor John Carlin announced that a Chinese exhibit from Henan province will come to the Kansas State Fair this year. But the governor jumped the gun a little. Cake's Bernie Cook reports from Hong Kong.
It happened as the governor was meeting with U.S. Consul General Richard Williams. The discussion was about trade relations with China. The governor is in Asia to try to drum up some Kansas business with the Chinese. Apparently, the governor was so interested in the conversation, he forgot there were reporters present. He told the Consul General that Henan province in China is definitely sending an exhibit to the Kansas State Fair at Hutchinson. Kansas Secretary of Economic Development Jimmy Schwartz almost choked. It seems the formal announcement is supposed to be made next week when the governor visits the province. State officials had confirmed long ago that an exhibit was in the works, but the fact that it has been set in concrete was kept a secret that is now out of the bag because Governor Carlin accidentally spilled the beans. From Hong Kong, this is Bernie Cook, Cake News.
A delegation of Kansas government and business officials were told yesterday that Hong Kong is not in danger of drastic change when it reverts to communist Chinese control in 1997. The Kansans, led by Governor John Carlin, are en route to China. Traveling with them is Larry Hatteberg.
It was Kansas Governor John Carlin who wanted to know about the status of the British colony. Much of Hong Kong has been leased to Great Britain since 1898, and the lease runs out in 1997. Most of the colony will then return to Chinese control. The director of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council said he thinks news accounts of the situation have blown things out of proportion. Lynn Dunning told Carlin the present lifestyle and economy here are helpful to the Chinese. He said the Chinese communists have had an excuse to reclaim Hong Kong 3 times in past history, during the communist takeover in 1949, during the Korean War, and during the radical Cultural Revolution. On all 3 occasions, the Chinese did nothing. Dunning told Carlin he's confident the Chinese will keep the colony as it is because it's too valuable as a trade center to change it. Larry Hatteberg, Cake News in Hong Kong.
Governor John Carlin's Kansas Trade Delegation is preparing to leave Hong Kong after a 2-day visit. The group is about to enter the People's Republic of China. Bernie Cook has this report.
Saturday has been a day off for the Kansans, a day to recuperate from the long flight over from the States, and a day to rest up for the upcoming travel. Some Kansans spent the day sightseeing and shopping, including the governor and Mrs. Carlin. The plan is to board a train at the Kowloon station Sunday morning. The train takes us to the Chinese border. where we get off for customs before reboarding and making our way to Canton in South China. Canton is basically an overnight travel stop before the airplane flight Monday to Henan province on the edge of China's north-central plain, the ultimate destination of this trip. Bernie Koch, Cake News in Hong Kong.
This week will be a big one for Governor John Carlin. Tomorrow he'll travel to Henan province in China to begin talks aimed at selling the Chinese on Kansas products and commodities. The governor's party is resting overnight in Guangzhou, but it was in Hong Kong that some news from home caught up with them. Larry Hatteberg has more.
It was the last thing the members of the Kansas Trade Delegation expected to see when they opened up today's morning newspaper in Hong Kong. But there it was, right on the front page, a story from Wichita. The headline said, Angry Fathers, and was about a Wichita group called Fathers for Equal Justice that's been demonstrating in front of the Sedgwick County Courthouse. Because it was Father's Day, the Hong Kong newspaper editors thought the story would be interesting to their readers, and it was, at least to the Kansans in the Trade Delegation. By noon, the group had left by train for Guangzhou, China, the first stop inside Communist China. Tonight, they're staying at the White Swan Hotel, one of the newest hotels in the city. Here, they found another Wichita connection. Computers for the hotel have been purchased by a company located where else? In Wichita. Larry Hatteberg, Cake News, Guangzhou, China.
And ironically, few Wichita news organizations devoted any time or space to that story. Governor John Carlin is about to plunge into a busy week of talking, handshaking, and ceremonies. It's not election time for him. It's to sell Kansas commodities and products in China. Bernie Koch reports on the Trade Delegation's Sunday.
Tonight we are in China. It is hot and humid. From the balcony of my room in Guangzhou, better known to Americans as Canton, I can look out on what might be a scene from New York or Philadelphia in the 1930s. People are walking in the streets. There are occasional firecrackers and rockets shooting over this lush city of 3 million. To the right of me is the wide Pearl River, boats making their way upstream and downstream, some modern, some powered by human muscle. This is a one-night stop for the group of Kansans traveling to Henan province. Tomorrow we fly to Zhengzhou, the capital. When the governor arrives, an impressive opening ceremony will take place, including greetings by 300 local school children. Carlin will meet the governor of the province and then participate in the opening ceremony of the International Machinery and Equipment Show. It is the province's first major trade fair. Businessmen from all over the world will be there, and by the way, the state of Kansas will have a booth. The first day will include several activities, including a banquet. In fact, there's so much to do that the Kansas group won't be able to check into their hotel until afternoon. The governor's schedule has been set for the week. It includes a lot of sightseeing. Press Secretary Mike Swenson says Carlin wants to get an overview of the province. The real nuts and bolts of this trip will take place when the governor of Kansas and the governor of Henan meet for private talks on Friday. Bernie Koch, Cake News, Guangzhou, China.
Kansas Governor John Carlin today told Chinese officials that he wants some straight talk about doing business between the state and Henan province. Cake's Bernie Koch is in China with the governor and has this report.
300 Chinese school children dancing, singing, and playing music greeted the Kansas Trade Mission at the Zhengzhou airport. The official motorcade was allowed to blatantly violate the capital city's traffic laws as it sped to a meeting with Communist Party officials and provincial leaders. Later, after a lengthy background discussion of the province, Governor Carlin got straight to the point. He wanted the week's schedule to remain flexible so that his staff and the Kansas business people on the trip would be free to do some horse trading on business deals. One Kansas official said privately that the real substantive talks are going on behind the scenes. About a dozen agreements have been proposed to the Chinese. Before the governor leaves, it's hoped that some of those deals will go through. Bernie Koch, Cake News, Zhengzhou, China.
Governor John Carlin arrived in Henan province in China today to talk about selling Kansas products and commodities. It's similar to his mission to China back in 1979. Cake's Larry Hatteberg has been along on both trips. Tonight, his first pictures of China, 1984.
This isn't the China that Governor Carlin visited 5 years ago. Today, China is moving towards capitalism. Where in 1979, Chairman Mao's sayings were plastered on billboards, today those same billboards contain ads for watches or washing machines. Small businesses are now encouraged rather than discouraged, and ruling Chinese leaders now say it's okay to be richer than your neighbor, a situation unheard of 5 years ago. Joint ventures in both technology and the building industry are underway, and everywhere you look, you see a more modern China going up with bamboo scaffolding. Tonight, a 12-course dinner ended the first full day for the Kansas Trade Delegation. The dinner, hosted by the governor of Henan province, echoed what we had seen in the streets of China. The Chinese governor called for modernization by the year 2000, and told Governor Carlin that Kansas would play a role in that because Henan province would give priority and favorable treatment to Kansans in future business transactions. Larry Hatteberg, traveling with the governor for Koch News in Chengzhou, China.
I'm sorry, we made a mistake. We obviously didn't have the pictures yet from China. They are late in arriving, and we hope to have them for you sometime soon. As the governor and his party continue their trade mission through China, the first pictures from their stop in Hong Kong have arrived back in Wichita. In Hong Kong, Governor Carlin met with the U.S. Consul General to prepare for his trip into China. Tonight at 6 and 10, Bernie Koch reports on the governor's visit to Hong Kong. And on Hatteberg's People at 10, Larry follows First Lady Karen Carlin on her tour of Hong Kong. Governor Carlin and his entourage are now in Zhengzhou, China, where they are talking to the Chinese about purchasing Kansas agriculture products. Earlier, the governor spent time in Hong Kong, where he received some encouraging news from U.S. officials. Bernie Koch has been traveling with the governor. Here's his report from Hong Kong.
This is Hong Kong. The name means fragrant harbor in Chinese. The shipping convenience to this port is one reason it can boast a booming economy. The new high-rise office buildings bear that out. The British Crown colony is a major world financial market. Only New York and London are bigger. One reason for the bustling commerce here is the people, 5.5 million of them. Despite the fact that Hong Kong has few natural resources, it's a major manufacturing center because it has such a huge workforce. Another factor in the economic growth is that Hong Kong is the gateway to China, and China is coming into its economic own. It seemed only fitting that Governor Carlin pause here before going to China. His first official stop was the office of the U.S. Consul General, a man who has lived in China and still keeps track of what's going on there. In a briefing for the Kansas Trade Delegation, Consul Richard Williams said that things have changed dramatically since Carlin visited China in 1979, and that his timing in coming again now is excellent. But it seemed that the U.S. officials knew little about the area where Carlin is going, Henan province. Carlin was asked about that lack of information by reporters after the briefing ended.
Two things. One, you're correct. They don't know as much about a particular province, Henan province, that we'll be dealing with, but it also points out the advantages of Kansas getting in there and really being aggressive. The competition isn't as much there. There's far greater potential, and they're really anxious for that involvement. It's a matter now whether we can follow through and really take full advantage of the potential that's there.
Carlin left the U.S. Consulate with one other bit of information about Chinese politics that gave him reason to be optimistic about the Chinese getting involved in commerce with Kansas business.
It seems that just last month, the Communist Party Congress meeting in Beijing issued some new policies which emphasize foreign trade with Western nations in particular. One political officer at the U.S. Consulate told Governor Carlin that many communists in local provinces will probably be chomping at the bit to adhere to the new policies and show that they are good communists. Bernie Koch, Koch News, Hong Kong.
Some critics have complained that Governor Carlin's trip to China is more pleasure than business. But the pleasure part of the trip isn't always so pleasant, especially when you consider the menu at a dinner honoring the Kansas delegation yesterday evening. The dinner consisted of 9 courses and included such delicacies as sea slugs, monkey head, turtle soup, squid, and hog tendons. Today it was back to business for the governor, and Larry Hatteberg has the back page.
The day began with an acupuncture demonstration. The governor and his group were actually inside an operating room where brain surgery was being performed on a 45-year-old woman. With acupuncture needles inserted at key points, she was conscious during the entire procedure. Then it was on to two Chinese universities. At Consulate University, Carlin met 35-year-old Margaret Carney Ryan, a University of Kansas student studying for her doctorate in archaeology. She's been here for almost a year, and Carney Ryan told us it was strange to see Americans, and she really wants some Baskin-Robbins ice cream. Later, after a tour of a cotton mill, there was an embarrassing moment at an agricultural commune. The governor, who's been a dairy farmer all his life, wanted to milk a cow, and it became apparent that the Chinese did not want him to. After watching a commune worker milk the cow, the governor was told it was time to go. Carlin's staff speculated that because milking a cow is peasant's work here, the Chinese sense of propriety would not allow such an important official to perform such a task. From Chengzhou, China, this is Larry Hatteberg, Cake News.
Governor John Carlin's trade mission to the Far East spent a few days in Hong Kong before traveling to China. Bernie Cook reports that could mean more foreign trade for Kansas.
Over 25% of all Chinese foreign exports go through Hong Kong before making their way to the rest of the world. It seemed only logical that Governor John Carlin talked to officials in Hong Kong about doing business with China before the Kansas delegation traveled to the People's Republic. He did just that at the U.S. Consul General's office in Victoria, Hong Kong. It was there that Consul Richard Williams told the Kansas Trade Delegation that the timing of the mission to China was excellent. Williams and his staff said the Chinese have just recently issued some new economic policies through the Communist Party Congress, policies that encourage an open door to foreign trade. Carlin came from the briefing especially pleased because the U.S. officials backed up his trip by saying that a visit by a governor really does help.
The fact that as a state, my trip in '79, my coming back, it's still important to keep those doors open at the highest level of government so that the private sector and others can come in. You've got to have an invitation. You've got to be a part of it as an accepted member of the team, or you don't deal with the Chinese.
It wasn't just U.S. officials that told Carlin this trip is a good idea. Later in Hong Kong, officials of the Hong Kong Trade Development Council practically echoed the same comments. They said Carlin is probably here at exactly the right time. Bernie Cook, Cake News, Hong Kong.
And as we said, tonight's edition of Hatteberg's People originates in China. Here's Larry.
Hong Kong is one of the world's busiest trade centers, and as such, billions of dollars worth of business is conducted here every year. Part of that business comes from tourists. Tourists like the governor's wife, Karen Carlin. Shopping in Hong Kong is really no different than shopping in any other large American city. So while her husband attended briefings, Mrs. Carlin spent time just window shopping in Kowloon across the bay from Hong Kong. For the past year, First Lady Karen Carlin has been keeping a low profile around the State House. A year ago, she took the media spotlight away from her husband when she became embroiled in a controversy over making money through her position as First Lady. So now, Mrs. Carlin is still a bit wary of the media, but permitted us to follow her around one of Hong Kong's shopping districts. Hong Kong officials warned Mrs. Carlin and other members of the trade delegation to hold their purses tight when they went shopping because of the many pickpockets who take advantage of the crowded streets. At the end of one of the day's many briefings, the governor did find time to meet his wife at a shoe store where the clerk wanted to sell them custom-made sharkskin shoes. After looking at several grades of sharkskin, the governor finally settled on plain old leather. So how much does a custom pair of shoes cost in Hong Kong? Well, about $70 in U.S. currency. The Hong Kong stops were designed not only for briefing the trade delegation about what they might expect in China, but also to let jet lag catch up so they won't be tired when they arrive in the People's Republic. For some, it's sleep that relaxes, but for others, it's window shopping. Laurie Hatteberg with the Governor's Trade Delegation in Hong Kong.
While Governor Carlin has been touring Henan province, some of the business members of the China tour have been trying to line up some deals. Bernie Cook tells us one Kansas businessman thought he had a contract lined up yesterday, but nothing has been signed yet. Nonetheless, the Kansas businessmen remain optimistic.
Another Kansas businessman wants to sell grain storage technology, but to do that, he has to see the Chinese grain elevators first. He hasn't seen them yet. One veteran businessman who's dealt with the Chinese before says that's just the culture here. The Chinese, he says, are working toward getting a better price. Communism also presents problems, since many final decisions have to be made by committees or at higher levels. Despite the lack of tangible success, hopes remain high. After all, 25% of the people of the world live in China, and China wants to modernize. Bernie Cook, Take News, Zhengzhou, China.
While Kansas businessmen are hammering out deals with the Chinese, the governor has taken some time to see what life is like on a Chinese farm. Larry Hatteberg has the story on tonight's back page.
While Kansas businessmen continue their contract negotiations with the Chinese, Governor Carlin and his staff toured the ancient city of Luoyang. Luoyang is one of the oldest cities in China, and here is called the cradle of civilization. In the 2-hour drive between the cities of Chengzhou and Luoyang, the governor saw what Chinese rural life is really like. Unlike Kansas, the farm fields here have been tilled for 4,000 years, and the method of farming hasn't changed much. Wheat is thrashed 3 times just to make sure none of the grains are lost, a far cry from the mechanized farming in Kansas. Governor John Carlin is believed to be the highest-ranking foreign government official ever to tour this province. All along the route, in the small villages, people would smile and stare at the caravan of Americans as they drove through their area. Once, the governor stopped at an open-air market and pinned a sunflower on an old Chinese farmer. A crowd quickly gathered and clapped their approval, as is Chinese custom. Tomorrow, the touring ends, and the governor will find out how successful his trip has been when he meets privately with the governor of the province here in China to discuss current and future business deals. Tonight, the Kansas businessmen along on the trip say agreements could be signed as early as Friday for millions of dollars in agribusiness-related goods and services from Kansas companies. Larry Hatteberg, Koch News, Zhengzhou, China.
Governor John Carlin has left Henan province in China and is in Peking tonight. Bernie Cook is with the governor's trade mission to the Far East and has this report.
The governor left the city of Zhengzhou this morning, the capital of Henan province. But before leaving, he and the governor of the province together spread some grass seed on the ground near the Henan guest house. The idea was to show the sealing of the friendship between the people of Kansas and the people of the province of Henan. The governor is saying that it's been a successful trip, and so are the businessmen who've been along. The 6 businessmen have all signed preliminary letters of intent with the Chinese. A letter of intent is a little bit different in Chinese than it is in the United States. In Chinese, a letter of intent, translated very literally, means that it would have to take something very drastic to happen before the business deal would not go through. It is a very binding sort of signing. And the businessmen who came along, of the 6, 5 have signed business deals or preliminary letters of intent for goods and services primarily related to agriculture and agribusiness, which will bring the businessmen between $5 and $10 million. On Sunday, the governor and his trade mission will have sort of a day off. They will be touring the Great Wall of China and perhaps the Ming tombs. Already this evening, they met with Vice Premier Yao Yilin, who is considered the top, one of the 5 or 6 top leaders in the Chinese government. And on Monday, the governor will leave for Tokyo for the second leg of his mission, where he will be talking to private businessmen in Japan, with particular emphasis on the automobile industry, trying to recruit automobile investment in Kansas. From Beijing, or Peking, as most Americans know it, this is Bernie Cook, Koch News.
A U.S. grain deal with the People's Republic of China is back on again. Chinese Vice Premier Yao Yilin yesterday confirmed that China will take an order for 340,000 metric tons of wheat that was canceled 6 weeks ago. He made this statement during a courtesy visit with the Kansas Trade Mission led by Governor John Carlin. That's good news for Kansas farmers, even though we don't know how much Kansas wheat the Chinese might ultimately buy. This year's harvest promises to be a large one, so Kansas farmers say any foreign grain sales will expand the total market for U.S. wheat and end up benefiting Kansans one way or another. Well, Governor Carlin's trade mission to China is in Beijing tonight after spending most of the week in Henan province. Kansas has established a sister state relationship with that province, and this week it paid off for most of the businessmen traveling with the governor. Koch's Bernie Cook is with the governor tonight and has a report via satellite.
I think she's making some plans so that...
It's been a very busy week for the Kansas Trade Delegation. Mr. Governor Carlin, as the Chinese call him, has been meeting and socializing with provincial and Communist Party officials. He's also been touring much of the Henan countryside, including ancient temples and historic areas. The reason is to learn more about Henan province. While all this was going on, other Kansas officials and 6 businessmen were talking turkey with the Chinese. $1-million deals were being worked out.
We ended up with letter of intent to build a bakery over here for 1 and perhaps 2 later on down the line. This will include technology, it'll include the expertise to run it, and this sort of thing.
This is a big order for us. This would be a very big order for us.
How big? Do you have any idea in dollars?
I think it's going to be well over $1 million, what we're talking about with the current scope of supply.
Kansas economic development officials estimate that the Kansas businessmen have signed letters of intent for anywhere from $5 to $10 million. Future spin-off deals are also possible. Governor John Carlin also signed some agreements for scientific, educational, and cultural exchanges with Governor He of Henan. Those include an agreement giving a favored status to Kansas in trade and something that could have a dramatic impact on Henan province.
And one of the agreements I signed was a very comprehensive agreement on the part of KP&L to come here and assist them in a very detailed energy plan for the future. It's one that they readily received and accepted, and one that could have dramatic effects on the future of this province and our relationship because of all the spin-off benefits from what that plan could do for other developments.
The businessmen on this trip who have been to China before say Carlin's presence here has undeniably helped their efforts. Kansas economic development officials say timing has had a lot to do with the success of this trip. Last month, the Communist Party issued some new guidelines for foreign trade, encouraging it with foreigners, and local officials here seem anxious to do business with the Kansas businessmen. From near Luoyang, China, I'm Bernie Cook, Koch News.
With all that wheeling and dealing, it's easy to forget that people, not paper, are at the heart of business. Larry Hatteberg has this sketch of the personal side of the trade trip to China.
When the airplane landed at Changzhou Airport, history was made. Governor Carlin became the highest-ranking foreign government official to ever visit this provincial capital. 300 children chanted, warm welcome, as the governor and other members of the Kansas Trade Delegation spent their first full day in the People's Republic of China. The colorful arrival ceremony began a week of intense negotiations for state officials and businessmen who accompanied the governor. Most of those negotiations took place behind closed doors as the delegation attempted to sell Kansas to the Chinese. China is an open market for Kansas businessmen, especially those who deal in agribusiness products. Agriculturally, this country is much the same as it was 3,000 years ago. Changzhou, the capital of Henan province, is a city of 900,000 people, but is considered to be one of the poorest provinces. It was this side of China Governor Carlin saw as he toured the remote areas around Changzhou. In Changzhou proper, the governor was shown large industrial areas that included this cotton mill that produces 60 million square meters of cloth per year. It was an efficient shop, but the equipment was old. Then, just on the outskirts of town, the governor saw grain being threshed by hand for the 3rd time because the Chinese want to make sure that every kernel of wheat gets used.
It's incredible how much effort they go to get every last grain.
By the time the governor left Henan province, business deals had been signed and trade agreements ratified. So now, with a major catch for the Kansas businesses, the door is open for even more trade with China, which could mean more jobs for Kansans. Then with a royal send-off, the governor now heads to Japan and trade talks with the Japanese. Larry Hatteberg, Koch News, Changzhou, China.
By a lucky coincidence, Governor Carlin's trip to China coincided with a major event in the area he visited. Bernie Cook has this report on tonight's back page.
This is the 8th largest exhibition hall in China. It's at Changzhou, the capital of Henan province. Inside this massive structure is the first international trade show ever held in the province. Business people from all over the world display their products in the hope the Chinese will buy them. Governor and Mrs. John Carlin even found someone from close to home.
Aaron, nice to meet you. Dean Armstrong's my name. I'm a Missouri resident. That's okay. former Kansas resident.
Kansas economic development people say the province has about $200,000 to spend at this event.
This show is probably a pretty good indication that a lot of people from all over the world are interested in Henan province and that it's going to be growing economically.
Hoping to attract some Chinese dollars to Kansas, the Economic Development Department has a booth here.
Hope to give some visibility to the products and commodities that the state of Kansas has to offer. And this is an international trade show, not just for the province, but worldwide, and we hope to give some visibility to what we have to sell.
Is this a good way to do business in Kansas? Is it a very common way to sell product?
Yes, sir. Very popular way to give exposure to your products. Very inexpensive way to promote your goods.
But things don't always work out the way you plan them. Take this combination slide projector and tape recorder. State officials found it doesn't work right. The slides don't change when they're supposed to. That's because China has a totally different electrical system. And Governor Carlin couldn't show Governor He of Henan Province the slideshow. Instead, Carlin formally announced that Henan is sending an exhibit to the state fair at Hutchinson.
But Henan Province will be the first foreign country to have an exhibit at our state fair, period.
So, all ended well, except that state officials still don't know how to get their slides presented in China. Bernie Cook, Koch News, Changzhou, China.
One of the preliminary business agreements revealed during Governor Carlin's visit to China is for a joint venture tourist hotel in Zhengzhou. The man who made the deal is Overland Park businessman Clifford Roth. Larry Hatteberg was in Zhengzhou with the governor and has this report on the tourist attractions near where the hotel would be built.
Although the hotel will be built in Changzhou, many of the tourist attractions are an hour and a half away in Luoyang. It is this area that is known as the cradle of civilization. 9 dynasties established their capital here, including the Qin dynasty, where China got its name. Because so much history is encompassed in the area, more modern hotels are needed. New hotels in some of China's larger cities are already springing up. These are being financed as joint ventures with capital coming from outside investors. Governor Carlin got a chance to play tourist and to see this area and all the history that it holds. Some of the more famous sites are the Longmen Grottos, a world-famous art treasure housed in caves. Over 100,000 Buddhist statues are carved into the side of the mountain. Ancient Buddhist temples are located all over this part of China, and they too attract strong tourist trade. But there would no doubt be even more tourists if hotel facilities in Henan were upgraded, as Kansan Clifford Roth hopes to do. And there is one treasure that you can see anywhere in China. It's people. That's what the governor found everywhere he went, whether they were school children or just people on the street.
This is a real special sunflower, Kansas sunflower.
It is clear that China's people are its major asset. Larry Hatteberg, Koch News, Changzhou, China.
One of the biggest export markets for U.S. farm products is Japan. This week, Governor John Carlin is visiting that island nation, trying to increase those farm sales. But he's also there to encourage Japanese investment in Kansas. Bernie Cook has a report tonight from Tokyo.
Although there are problems, the U.S. has a good trade relationship with Japan. And this hub of business activity wants to further that by building plants in the United States. One reason is that Japan is crowded. Everywhere, land is expensive. In fact, if you don't have a place to park a car, you're not allowed to own one. By comparison, U.S. land costs are cheap, so the Japanese want to build in the States. Governor John Carlin found that out as he visited the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, where he learned there's another reason to build Japanese industrial plants in the U.S., maybe even in Kansas.
The Japanese are not unaware of the difficulties that pure imports cause the American industry and American workers. And one way of mitigating that is, of course, to invest in the United States and use the American worker and the American managerial know-how in our market to produce in the market with products that they themselves have proven. And
Carlin and his group have spoken to several officials here this week in an effort to convince the Japanese that Kansas would be a good place to build. U.S. Embassy officials say it's important for Kansas to visit Japan often if it wants to do business here. The last time a Kansas governor visited Japan was 11 years ago, and the officials here say that's too long. Bernie Cook, Koch News, Tokyo.
After 8 days in the People's Republic of China, members of the Kansas Trade Delegation were starved for home-style food. Larry Hatteberg found they picked a Tokyo restaurant that Wichitans should know well.
In their first evening in the crowded city of Tokyo, members of the Kansas Trade Delegation were like sharks circling their prey. They wanted some familiar home cooking, and they found it at a Tokyo Pizza Hut.
This is self-serving pizza. Salad. I can't wait to have salad.
Oh. Pizza Huts in Tokyo are a little different than the freestanding ones back home. This one was located down a flight of stairs, but inside it still looked familiar. The menus in Japanese and English contained many of the same items that you'd find in a Wichita Pizza Hut, with some exceptions. Whiskey is available in these huts, and the salad bar contains a different selection of vegetables. But after 8 days of Chinese food, the small differences were not important to the governor.
Chinese food's okay, but we need a break, and this is a good way to start.
After the pizzas were ordered and the cooks were busy in the kitchen, a reporter asked the governor why he decided to eat here.
Karen picked pizza because she wanted pizza, and we thought of Pizza Hut first, obviously, and it does make a nice little beginning to our Japanese visit to consider that the Pizza Hut started in Kansas.
The manager of the Pizza Hut, Mr. Sakata, said he had been to the international headquarters of the corporation in Wichita for training. So we asked him what he thought of the city.
Which they very boring, just, flat and nothing to do.
In China, because we couldn't drink the water, a glass here in Tokyo was a real treat.
Nice little added touch that we haven't had for a while.
When the pizza was served, no one was disappointed. In China, the delegation had eaten sparrow, sea slugs, tree fungus, pig intestines, fish stomachs, and another little delicacy called cow face. So at the Pizza Hut in Tokyo, it was like coming home again, and the governor loved it.
Terrific. If it had Kansas beef, it'd be sensational.
In Japan, the governor is trying to promote Kansas to the Japanese. But on this night, their mission was to find some Kansas-born products already in Japan.
Was it good?
Right.
It was a mission that was not so impossible. Larry Hatteberg, Koch News, Tokyo.
And Larry says 2 months ago they did start importing American beef to the Japanese Pizza Huts. Governor John Carlin returned to Kansas yesterday after nearly 3 weeks in the Far East, promoting Kansas business and agriculture. Bernie Cook and Larry Hatteberg went along on the trip, but are also back. We have 2 of their reports tonight, beginning with Bernie's on the overall trip.
It took 4 years to reach this point, the governor of Kansas and the governor of Henan province signing 7 agreements on a sister-state relationship, a partnership that has already boosted the business interests of Kansas. The sister-state relationship and the governor's presence made it easier for the businessmen on the trip.
Well, it certainly did, because what happens, it cuts a lot of the red tape, and you can get the right people in the right time, and I think Eldon Fastrup and I think the governor's office have done an excellent job in setting it up, and certainly whenever one needed to talk to someone, they could certainly arrange it, and it was indeed done.
China has not been a good market for us. I think the governor's trip has provided an excellent forum for the businessmen, and I think they'll all agree with that by having the governor here, it has really enhanced the ability to do business.
Much of the governor's time was spent being a tourist, while other state officials worked out the nuts and bolts of the relationship. That's the way the Chinese wanted it. In addition to viewing ancient Chinese culture, the governor got to see some things the average tourist never sees, like brain surgery using acupuncture. We were actually in the operating room. Then there were the Chinese banquets, where it would have been impolite to not at least taste the fish intestines. In the next few weeks, Larry Hatteberg and I will report on the culture and government of China. At the end of the trip, Governor Carlin pronounced it a success.
Our timing could not have been better, and I feel we have the commitment and the resources to follow through, which will be the next critical step in terms of how we profit from this type of investment.
After China, the governor came here to Japan, where he talked to Japanese industry about locating in Kansas. He also made a quick trip to some nearby Americans who are here on a different sort of mission.
Larry Hatteberg has that story.
Flying high above the Tokyo skyline, Governor Carlin was about to meet some of his constituents, 8,000 miles from Kansas. The governor was a guest of the United States 7th Fleet, headquartered in Tokyo Bay on the Navy ship the USS Blue Ridge. The view out the governor's green-tinted helicopter window was about as far from Kansas as you can get. Tokyo wasn't Topeka, but it was the last stop on the governor's trade mission to the Orient. The USS Blue Ridge is the command ship of the U.S. 7th Fleet. Her responsibility is 52 million square miles of ocean from the Middle East to the Orient. But this day, her responsibility was to play host to Kansas Governor John Carlin. And waiting for him was the commander of the 7th Fleet, Vice Admiral James Hogue.
Beautiful one it is.
Thank you very much, Jim Hogg.
These were just the formalities. The real mission for the governor was to greet as many Kansas sailors as he could, and many were waiting for him.
Van Asherman's Hoisington.
From Hoisington?
Yes, sir.
Another old central Kansas lady
Yes,
town.
sir. You give autographs and other...
The men in this room were from Norton, Ark City, Dodge City, Lindsborg, Salina, Hutchinson, and several other small Kansas communities. And some hadn't been home for 3 years.
From Sterling, okay. Sterling, Hoisington, St. John. Very good. Good to see you.
Governor, I'm a ringer in the crowd. I went to Kansas State and graduated in '73. Originally from Connecticut.
Very good. Very nice of them to throw you in, though. Very appropriate.
Thank you, sir.
For a souvenir of the visit, each sailor got his picture taken with the state's chief executive. The Navy invited the governor because they felt it was a chance to get some needed publicity for the work that the 7th Fleet does. So the governor got the grand tour of the ship and a briefing on the world situation as seen through the eyes of the Navy brass.
And they're just local control. I have 180 different antennas and can communicate around the world to ourselves if we have to.
With the governor's visit, the Navy got their publicity, and the governor may have garnered a few absentee ballots should he decide to run for public office again. Larry Hatteberg, Koch News with the 7th Fleet in Tokyo Bay.
Governor John Carlin and members of his trade mission returned home from the Far East over the weekend. And while most of them are probably taking a few days to wind down from the trip, there's no rest for Larry Hatteberg or Bernie Koch, our news team accompanying the governor to China. They're now in the newsroom with Mark to discuss the experience and the stories they're preparing. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much, Rick. First of all, Bernie, Larry, welcome back. It's good to have you here.
Thank
3
you.
weeks ago, we said bon voyage, and every time we talked on the phone, you said you were exhausted, so I know it was a very difficult trip physically for you. Bernie, this was your first time overseas in China. Tell us what struck you the most. What did you find the most fascinating? What did you find the most difficult in terms of covering something journalistically?
I guess the thing that was most fascinating to me was, of course, the differences in the culture. You just walk down a road or drive down a road in China, and there are people riding bicycles, there are horses pulling carts, there are people pulling carts. You don't see many cars and trucks on the road except those that are owned by governments. Just a big difference in the way people live, especially the way people eat, too. We had some interesting food.
How did you adapt to that culture?
I lost about 8 pounds on the food. We had things like, they call them sea cucumbers, but they're actually sea slugs. Have little fins on them. We had fish stomach and cow's face, and some of the food was good, and some of it you didn't want to ask what it was.
Larry Hatteberg, you've always been an expert at talking to the people and getting them to talk back to you. How did you find the Chinese people, and how were you welcomed over there as a working journalist?
Well, it was my second time over there, and I found the Chinese people to be as warm and friendly as they were 5 years ago, but there have been a lot of changes in China. There's an interesting thing, though, that we can't show you on television. We have some video here of people working in the fields, and we can show you the video, and we can show you how difficult it is to see people slogging around in the rice paddies, working 12 to 15 hours a day in this back-breaking work, but we can't show you the smells that we smelled when we were out here. What people don't realize is that these fields are fertilized with human fertilizer, known as night soil, basically. And here in Kansas, you go out to a wheat field or where they're growing products, and you have the sweet smell of the outdoors. In China, there is no sweet smell. It is simply human waste, and they utilize everything that they have. They don't let anything go to waste. But this work is so different than the way we work here in this country. There's another interesting thing. 83% of China's population works on a farm like you're seeing here. And the interesting thing is, what happens if China mechanizes? What do they do with 830 million people
who are working in agriculture?
They would have real problems.
Bernie Cook, this was a trade mission. Governor Carlin went over there to enhance the relationship between Kansas and China. We're going to be having some reports from you about this. What can you tell us about the reports we'll be seeing from you on Cover Story tonight at 10?
Okay, on Cover Story tonight at 10, I'm going to take a look at Chinese business and how the Chinese do business. They do things a little bit differently. They have letters of agreement, which are very binding. It takes something very drastic for them not to go through with that. That presents some difficulties for American businessmen who are used to having a contract signed first before they do anything. But this is very binding. There's also the area of language. There are language differences. The people in the trade mission came away with between $5 and $10 million worth of business from the Chinese, and there are other business deals in the works. China is really booming. As Larry said, when he went to Guangzhou, or as we know, Canton, several years ago, he stayed in a hotel that had mosquito nets. This time there's a brand new hotel, a joint venture hotel called the Great Wall, and it's as nice as any hotel you'll see in any major city in the Western world.
Larry, we have about 30 seconds left. We talked a minute ago about the tough business practices of the Chinese. You have a little story to recount about a little business venture you had over there.
Well, as you know, we satellited from Beijing back several of our stories. And it costs a lot of money to satellite back, and we'd already paid the money here in the U.S. For all the satellite time. When we arrived at the feeding point in the capital city of China, in Beijing, we had to feed, of course, from China State Television. And our feed was set at 11 o'clock at night. When we arrived, just before the feed, the woman who was helping us said that for us to complete our feed, she would need $400 US cash.
Cold cash,
Cold
no
cash
receipt.
on the barrelhead, no receipt, I'm sorry, that's it, or you don't feed. So we had to come up with $400 immediately to make the satellite feed, or we wouldn't have got our video out.
Okay, just one in a series of fascinating stories from China. You'll be seeing those stories from Bernie Cook and Larry Hatteberg over the next 2 weeks on.
Meanwhile, the governor has just returned from a 2.5-week trade mission to the Orient. While he was there, Governor Carlin worked to finalize an agreement establishing a sister state relationship with the central China province of Henan. Bernie Cook reports on just what that agreement means.
Henan province contains 74 million people, most of them involved in agriculture. By our standards, conditions are primitive. The Chinese want to modernize and will use the sister state relationship with Kansas to accomplish that end. Talks between Kansas officials and Henan officials have been going on for 4 years on the agreement. They were finalized last week.
Wherever possible, in terms of purchases from the United States, Henan province is going to give Kansas preferential treatment.
The sister state relationship has already paid off for Harry Salisbury of Neotiche. He speaks Chinese and has been here frequently. Salisbury is selling the province a feed mill and the technology that goes with it for about $1 million.
We've done, over the last few years, 30 to 40% of our business in Asia. China has not been a good market for us.
The sister state relationship also helped Matt Hesser of Overland Park, who sold the Chinese a bakery.
Certainly, it made it a lot easier. It's like saying, yes, I think it probably could have been done, but it would have taken a heck of a lot longer, and this is my fourth trip over, so I think it cut the ice pretty quick as far as I'm concerned, putting it in a local vernacular, I guess.
The Chinese will use the sister state relationship to buy the goods and services they need to modernize. Kansas business will use it to make money. Cultural, educational, and scientific exchanges will also take place. Governor Carlin did not start all of this. It was Governor Robert Bennett who made the first contact with the Chinese. Carlin hopes that whoever succeeds him as governor continues the relationship for the benefit of both Kansas and Henan province. Bernie Cook, Cake News, Zhengzhou, China.
On Cover Story tonight, Bernie Koch begins a week-long look at the governor's trade mission to the Far East. While in China, the Kansas businessmen who went with the governor signed agreements totaling $5 to $10 million worth of business. Here's Bernie with some insight into the process of doing business with the People's Republic of China.
China is a land of stark contrasts. On a typical rural road, the transportation system of agriculture is literally horsepower and human muscle. But in the cities, China is becoming a world leader in the production of textiles. New hotels are springing up as China opens up to outsiders, many who come to view the remnants of one of the world's first civilizations.
Doing business in China is a little bit different. For example, a United States businessman might think that the most important part of a business deal was the signing of a contract. Here in China, it's not that way. The most important part is the preliminary signing of a letter of intent.
The signing of a letter of intent is very binding. Both sides understand it will take something drastic and dramatic to nullify it. More of them are being signed every day because China wants to modernize.
It's not going to happen if they stay in their office in Kansas. But I do believe that if they have an appropriate product, that there is a good opportunity to have it sold here. But they'll have to come here and knock on the doors.
Why do the Chinese want a bakery? Can't they do it themselves?
They decided beginning in 1982 that they wanted to have American style or the white pan bread, sliced bread type baked goods. This is to supplement the diet. You cannot add a lot of iron and other nutrition to rice, and of course that's the staple of the diet, and they would like to add various vitamins, minerals, and iron and that sort of thing, and wheat is an excellent vehicle in which to do that, also protein.
Well, I am convinced there is some potential in Henan, and I'm also convinced that Henan, if possible, is going to use as much of Kansas products as they can. Now, I would think that most agricultural companies have probably got something that may be of use here. And I would certainly think it would be worthwhile for them to take a look and pursue it.
Because the majority of business in China is run by the communist government, the businessman is dealing with government officials. Those officials like to deal with people they know, and the Henan Province Kansas sister state relationship is opening the door for many Kansas businessmen. Those from Kansas on this trip say future follow-up deals are already in the works, deals that will tie China's fast-moving growth to the economy of Kansas. Bernie Koch, Cake News, Zhengzhou, China. This farm field in Henan Province is typical of what you see in rural China. Hundreds of workers take to the fields daily, where they meticulously care for their small plots of land. In the new responsibility system, they can sell anything extra for their own personal profit.
Oh, the cows are next.
Yes.
Okay.
Governor Carlin's group visited one farming area that was a little different. It's not called a commune anymore, it's a village. A young woman is the mayor, but the local Communist Party leader is the real power. Fruit is the big crop at this village, but it's diversified. They have their own soybean processing factory, and they also make a kind of Chinese popsicle. There are about 600 pigs and 100 head of dairy cattle. From what we can tell, this is the Chinese equivalent of a cowboy.
But where did the younger bull come from?
Born here.
The younger bull was born here too?
Yes.
135 families live here, working about 125 acres of land. They do well by U.S. standards.
Their gross income from that's about $1 million, which is dramatically different because we take a Kansas farm that's 160 acres, and we might get 15,000.
This village does not have the individual responsibility system. Instead, the whole village shares in any profit above the quota set by the government. Nearby is the Yellow River, one of the world's major waterways, so irrigation is easy. But the Chinese work hard and take nothing for granted.
It was only a few short weeks ago that this field was full of wheat. That wheat's now been harvested and the rice is already up.
We saw farm workers threshing the wheat in a scene reminiscent of 19th century America.
It's incredible how much effort they go to get every last grain. I mean, they said this is maybe the third time they've worked the straw to get the last kernel out.
China wants to modernize agriculture, increasing production by 400% by the end of the century. That brings up a big question. If China modernizes and mechanizes, what will the 80% of the population that's involved in agriculture do for a living? The Chinese seem to feel those people will be free to work in other areas, thus increasing the industrial output of the country, leading to rapid modernization. If that happens, the whole Chinese way of life will change, a way of life that's been around for thousands of years. For Cover Story, this is Bernie Cook, Cake News.